Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us on Zoom and also on social media. My name is Kadir Üstün. I'm the Executive Director at the SETA Foundation at Washington, D.C. Today, we are hosting an expert panel discussion on the future of US-Russia relations, implications for the Middle East. Originally, my colleague Kılıç Kanat was going to moderate this session, but he's traveling and he's in between things. Because of that, I'm gonna sit in for him. As you all know, since the end of the since the end of the Cold War, American-Russian relations have seen many ups and downs, depending on the administration in Washington, D.C. There's been resets, and then there's been moments of crises with each successive presidency, and President Trump sought better relations with Russia, but the bilateral relationship has been difficult due to a number of geopolitical and security issues, not to mention Russian interference in US elections, and US intelligence agencies are still assessing that that's happening now for 2020 as well. So we want to focus on the strategic competition between the two and how it plays out in the Middle East, in various Middle Eastern theaters, including Syria, Libya, Iran, perhaps Israel. It touches on so many issues. We'll see how many we can cover, but we have two great distinguished guests to discuss these issues. We have Professor Angela Stent. She's the director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies at Georgetown University. We also have Professor Mark Katz. He's professor of government and politics at George Mason University. He's also a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council. Professor Stent, Angela Stent's book on titled Putin's World, Russia Against the West and with the Rest, is just being published as paperback, and it's an updated version. So we are honored to promote that book as well. Go ahead and buy it and order it. We'll do the same. Where to start with US-Russia relations, right? That's not an easy question. Because of that, I'll just give some initial remarks. Time for initial remarks to both of our guests. Professor Stent, we'll start with you. How do you assess the current state of the relations and how you expect the future is going to be? Of course, we are about 80 days away from the US presidential election. And if there's a different administration, different things can happen. We'll discuss that later on. But how do you assess it right now, and how do you expect it will evolve? Thank you for joining us again.
Well, thank you too. I'm delighted to be on this panel with my
Did it freeze there?
Since Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. Because Russia is such a toxic subject domestically, because many Democrats believe that President Trump is only in the White House because of Russian interference. And so Russia itself, it's very difficult to have a reasonable discussion.
Angela, I think, can you just repeat what you said, because it froze for a bit?
Okay, start from the beginning?
Sure, that's fine.
Okay, so I was just saying US-Russian relations are worse than they've been at any time since Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, and that is because Russia is such a toxic domestic subject in the United States. It's a domestic polarizing subject in a way that it hasn't been since or the Soviet Union was even in the 1950s. And it's very hard to have a reasonable discussion about Russia, depending on which side of the political fence you are. And I was just saying that in the past couple of weeks, we've seen two dueling letters in Politico signed by distinguished people, one arguing for a reset with Russia, saying that much of the problems lie with what the US has done, and that we have to move beyond where we are and accept Russia. Because of Russian policy, and this is just part of the polarization. Are you hearing me better now?
We lost you last couple sentences.
Okay, sorry for the bad internet connection. I was just talking about these dueling letters and the
I think we'll let me just turn to Mark, and maybe in the meantime, Professor Stan's connection will.
Can I turn my camera off? Maybe
sure. If that
is that helping at all?
Let's try again.
Help?
Yeah,
what?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
All right.
I can hear you.
So I was just saying we do not have a unified in the United States. We have
we are having the same issues. Professor Stan, can you just log out and log back in? Maybe that would help. I'm going to turn to Professor Katz.
okay.
Mark, please go ahead with your initial remarks.
Right, thank you. Well, I certainly agree with everything Professor Stent had to say, and I think that in her previous book, not the most recent one, but her previous book, The Limits of Partnership, which talks about the bilateral, U.S.-Russian relations, since the end of the Cold War. What she points out is that at the beginning of every, new administration, there's been an American effort to reset relations, which the Russians have responded to somewhat as well. But that despite, the intentions of both sides to pursue a better relationship, it always seems to turn sour. And it turns sour over, mainly issues with regard to other countries. And this was true in the Cold War as well. And obviously there was strategic nuclear issues was a big bilateral issue, but mostly what we disagreed over was the rest of the world. And this pattern seems to be have reasserted itself. Certainly Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin both, I think, thought that they were going to have a better relationship at the beginning of the Trump administration in January 2017. And I think that both were disappointed. And the problem is that we just have different interests. It's not a question of the willingness of leaders to talk. And of course, Vladimir Putin isn't always so willing. And so, I would think that, depending on the outcome of the November elections, if we have, if Trump is reelected, I don't think this is going to improve Russian-American relations. I think we're going to see more of the same. I think that if Biden is elected, I would not be surprised if we see an attempt at a reset. And I think that the one thing that we will definitely see is that a President Biden would agree to renew the New START treaty, which is due to expire at the beginning of February 2021, and that this might, help a little bit. But there's an awful lot of baggage out there, and certainly the present crisis in Belarus is not going to help. Certainly, I think Vladimir Putin, he has shown an inclination to believe that whenever there is anything that goes wrong in the Russia or the former Soviet republics, that opposition is motivated by the United States. It somehow, it just couldn't be, by the locals themselves. And I have a feeling that the Belarus crisis, however it resolves itself, and I imagine it'll resolve itself in ways that are more favorable to Putin, that he's going to blame the West for this crisis and see a Western hand in this. And so I think that this will this will color the relationship, going into next year.
Thank you. I want to turn to Professor Stent once again
Can you
to
hear
sort
me
of
now?
summarize. Yeah, we are okay. Yes. Hopefully
Okay, you can
we'll
hear me
stay
now.
on. Yes.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
So I'm sorry I missed what Mark said. I think when I logged off, I was just saying, that at this point the Trump administration doesn't have a coherent policy toward Russia. Obviously, the president has a very different view than either the executive branch or the U.S. Congress. And there are two major issues. One of them, of course, is the imminent expiration of the New START treaty. We're in a situation where if this isn't renewed by February the 5th, we will have lost all agreements that regulate the 90% of the world's nuclear weapons that reside in the US and Russia. And that today, Marshall Billingsley is in Vienna, our arms control negotiator. He met with Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov, and he just said at the end, the ball is in Russia's court. So arms control is the major issue. And the other one is sanctions. And the reason I mention it is because we have rafts of sanctions passed by the Congress, very difficult to lift. And that has made it also very difficult for President Trump and President Putin even to convene this joint economic council where they wanted to improve business. So I know, I gather that Mark was talking about how the election might affect this. So I think if President Trump wins, he will clearly believe that this is a mandate for him to pursue a much better relationship with Russia. But frankly, there's only a limit to what he can do because he is hamstrung by these rafts of sanctions. He may abandon all arms control because, of course, the Trump administration wants China to be involved in the follow-on to New START. The Chinese have said that they won't be. The Russians are kind of lukewarm about that. So you clearly might have an attempt on the part of Trump to have some major new reset with Russia, but it's rather difficult to see how he can do that with the sanctions regime. And you could have a new arms race, because if there is no arms control agreement, President Trump's also talked about building major new weapons. Now, if Vice President Biden wins, I think certainly you will have a move to renew New START, or to extend it at least. The Biden administration would have, I think, under 2 weeks to do that, but they could do it. Beyond that, I do think that they would pursue some kind of normalization of relations, in as much as they might try and reestablish all of these channels of communication that were broken at the end of the Obama administration, have never been restored during the Trump administration. But there might also be much more pushback depending on what happens in the next 2 months. As you yourself mentioned, the Russians are interfering, we know now. And so depending on whether they continue to do this, I think this would impact on what a Biden administration might do going forward. Maybe, can I say a couple of words now about how that affects the Middle East? Okay.
Sure.
So, going forward, if Trump wins, you would see more of the same, I'm sure, in the Middle East policy, which is, of course, going after Iran. Iran is the focus of pressure, supporting Saudi Arabia, encouraging the other Gulf states to normalize relations with Israel, obviously maintaining the relationship with Israel, and a complex relationship with Turkey, which I'm sure we'll come back to. The difference, I think, under a Biden administration would be Iran, because I think a Biden administration might reconsider rejoining some form of a JCPOA, and certainly, would have a different attitude. The attitude towards Saudi Arabia might be different too. So I think those are 2 points that might change under a Biden administration. So assuming that there's no major reset in US-Russian relations if either candidate wins, because I think in the end, there's very limited room for maneuver, and the agenda is quite limited too between the United States and Russia. What does that mean for the Middle East? Russia, as we know, its return to the Middle East has been really one of the major successes of the Putin administration. Mark Katz has written a lot about this. I mean, Russia's the only major power who talks to all of the major groups on all sides of all issues in the Middle East, be they Sunni, Shia, be it Israel, be it different groups, the Kurds. And that role, obviously, and they've managed to do this on the cheap. What they've done in Syria is really not very expensive for them. And of course, Russia's newest strategic partners in the Middle East are in fact Saudi Arabia and Israel, both of whom hope that Russia can influence Iran to temper some of its ambitions and its actions in the region. So I think in Syria, what we see, and I think I question whether a lot of this now in the Middle East is an area of US-Russian rivalry and competition anymore. What I see in Syria is a US that's been withdrawing, Russia moving in to fill the vacuum. Obviously, Russia and Turkey have a very complicated relationship in Syria. We know right now these patrols have been suspended that they were doing after the US withdrawal. But Russia's going to remain in Syria and be the beneficiary of this, irrespective of who wins the election. The question for Russia really is, once the civil war winds down, are Russian and Iranian interests in fact compatible in Syria, or do they have other interests? Second point, Iran, and just to reiterate, I do think you could see a change in US-Russian cooperation in a Biden administration. Again, if they decide to negotiate with Iran, then, as we know, even in the Obama administration, they praised Russia for helping conclude this agreement. So I think you could see US-Russian, in fact, cooperation in Iran, maybe, that you're not seeing now. And then finally, a word on Israel. The Russian Foreign Ministry and the Russian Duma have welcomed the UAE-Israel agreement. They've only had praise for it. And I've been looking at some of the Russian commentary, I'm sure Mark has. And again, I haven't found too much there that's very negative about it. The other interesting point is, when the Kushner plan was first put forward by the Trump administration and it dealt with annexation, the Russians didn't have too much critical to say about either because of the precedent for the annexation of Crimea. So I think we should keep that in mind when we think about how they view these things going forward. So, of course, I think a Biden administration would go back to, promoting a two-state solution, which, of course, we haven't seen recently. But I don't see, for instance, Israel anymore as an area of US-Russian competition. I think, they have some very similar interests. They have different interests, obviously, but that's not an area of competition. So I think my final point is going forward, that the Middle East will be dealing with the US and Russia that will still be, there'll still be a rivalry between them, but the rivalry won't necessarily be playing out that much in the Middle East. And most Middle Eastern countries, I think, have been very adept at understanding how to deal with that. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. You've given us a lot of things to discuss going forward. Mark, did you want to add anything to these remarks? I have a couple questions on US-Russia first, and then I'm going to delve into Middle East. But if you have additional remarks, please go ahead.
Well, basically, I agree with Angela, and I think that the remarkable story of Russian policy is that Russia now gets along with every American ally in the Middle East, that they work very well with them all. And I think that certainly, should the US want to somehow exclude Russia from the Middle East, that's just not possible anymore, that America's allies all seem to be working with it now. And of course, they work with the Iranians too. Whereas Russian-American relations overall, I see as tense going forward, I think the Middle East is one region where, in fact, we might not see this tension play out. In other words, that there are very few issues on which we are really directly opposed. Now, the one I think is Iran, and we see the question of the UN arms embargo ending this coming October 18th to be precise. Temporary embargo that was imposed, to facilitate the Iranian nuclear accord. And as we just saw, the Trump administration's attempt to extend this indefinitely was resoundingly defeated. Only got, besides the U.S., just the Dominican Republic voted in favor, that Russia and China voted against, and 11 others, including our major allies, simply abstained. And so I think that this enhances Russia's ability to to argue that they're the ones who can talk to everyone, and whom, if we're going to keep things contained, that Russia has to be involved in this. What I think is that instead of a Russian-American conflict in the Middle East, the problem I think that Russian policy faces there is that they can't quite decide whether they want to work with the Middle East, including America's allies, somehow to the detriment of the US, while at the same time Russia is competing with certain Middle Eastern countries, Turkey in particular, as we see in Syria and in Libya. And I think with regard to Turkey, it's, Russia wants to encourage Turkey to move away from the United States, move away from the West in general, and yet Russia is not exactly willing to concede anything to Turkey, whether in Syria, in Libya, and now we're seeing in the Caucasus recently as well. And it just strikes me that these are mutually incompatible. Now, what Putin has been very good at, I think, up to now is in the Middle East and elsewhere, supporting opposing sides simultaneously. Now, normally this is not something that people really like. They want external powers to support them and not the other side. But Putin has managed to do this, and partly I think there's a fear factor. If you don't work with Putin, he'll just support your opponents all the more. But also, if you do work with Putin, Russia has an interest in keeping that going, especially if there's money involved, as there is with so many actors in the Middle East. But I have the sense that we may be reaching a point, especially with if the Iranian arms embargo, if Russia goes ahead and sells weapons to Iran, I think that Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, they're all going to continue working with Russia. But I don't think that they're going to limit, I think, the extent to which they see it as a reliable partner, that they certainly don't want to give up the relationship with the United States. And that this, I think, is, there's some inherent contradictions in the Russian foreign policy approach that I think may start to come to the fore. Of course, I've been saying that for years, and he's done pretty well. But I think this time it may well happen.
Do you think that's because, like Professor Stent alluded to, sort of U.S. is not really committing to the Middle East and trying to leave Syria? The remnants of U.S. forces are there on the basis of protecting the oil and then opposing Iran, etc. But largely, U.S. is not really that involved in the Syrian. Well, that could be arguable as well, but is that a consequence of U.S. not being as committed to the Middle East, you think?
Well, there's certainly, after there's been a fatigue, after Afghanistan, after Iraq, and, exactly what are we attempting to accomplish in Syria? ISIS rolled back, but then to whose benefit? And it appears to be to Iran's benefit in particular. I actually think that for the U.S., that in the Middle East, we prioritize the Iranian threat, and that I think I don't think people really want to say this, but that in fact I think, as a lot of other Middle Eastern actors, they'd rather see Russia involved in Syria than not if they're not being involved means just Iran is going to be involved. And I think that Israel and Russia in particular have been cooperating with this deconfliction agreement. That Russia doesn't challenge Iran, but they sure don't stop the Israelis from hitting Iranian targets, Hezbollah targets, and that's just fine. I think the Iranians must be very frustrated with their supposed friend and partner with the Russians, and so I think that this is something that we are seeing. In other words, there is some degree of validity to the argument that actually Russia, to some extent, can be seen as a partner vis-a-vis Iran, especially if you want to see it that way. And several of our allies do. And since our allies, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, all of whom have a lot of influence here in Washington, I have the sense that certainly in the Trump administration, that they may tend to see it that way as well. Remains to be seen about a possible Biden administration.
One more thing on Iran. In Bolton's book, he talks about his meeting with Putin, and Putin is not necessarily happy with Iranian presence in Syria, for instance, and so he kind of wants to. But isn't that a dynamic that, the more U.S. talks about Iran, it becomes a good card for Putin to play. He promises them arms, missiles, etc. But then he has something to negotiate with the U.S. for. So next, both, Trump administration is sure to be focused on Iran, let's say. Biden won't be able to ignore it either. So in any case, this is going to be, you feel like, is this going to be the main discussion for the US and Russia in the Middle East, Iran's role, and then Russia somehow ending up winning on that, because there's so much hyper focus, let's say, on Iran.
Well, what I do think we're going to see is that the Russians are going to announce some kind of arms deal with the Iranians. But the question is exactly what will this involve? And I think that they may be open to persuasion as to limiting what they sell. Also, the Iranians just can't pay all that much to begin with. And also, in terms of when it's delivered, the Russians have never been embarrassed about not delivering things to the Iranians, as we saw with the S-300 deal that they made and delayed and canceled, and then finally Putin restored. They're not shy about this. I would think that for Putin, it's transactional. If we see the renewal of New START, if we see Saudi and UAE arms purchases from Russia, and I'm sure that there's something from Israel that they would like to have as well, then I think that we may see a little bit more of a cooperative. They won't come out right out and say that, no, we're not going to sell anything, but that they will be more understanding. If the Russians don't see these things, then I think they're going to go ahead and make the point, you won't deal with us, you won't give in to us, we're not going to give in to you. So there.
Angela, under Obama, there was a big push for a reset, the famous reset button. We keep coming to that, but you also alluded to the possibility that there could be a new arms race under a Trump administration. In a sort of reset situation, let's say, they set out to do a reset. What would that really involve? Arms agreement, a new START agreement, you mentioned that, but what would be beyond, what would that involve? What would be beyond that as well?
It's a great question. And my previous book, I wrote about 4 failed resets that, every US president since the collapse of the Soviet Union has tried to pursue a reset with Russia, and it hasn't worked out that well, largely because we have very different understandings of what a better and a more productive relationship would look like. So this time, if there was some kind of reset, we're starting off at a much lower base even than the Obama administration did when Vice President Biden announced the reset in 2009. So I think, extending New START is the minimum there. Extending doesn't mean that that's the ultimate agreement. Clearly, there has to be a renegotiation of strategic arms control. 2011 was a long time ago. We have new systems. We have cyber issues. So we have a whole new systems that need to be incorporated. So that would, you'd maybe sign on to extend it as is for 3 years, 5 years, whatever, and then you'd negotiate a new agreement, including possibly China at some point if it's willing to. And then you have to think about the non-proliferation aspects of this. And one of the reasons why it would be dangerous not to have a New START agreement extended is not only that we'd lose verification procedures, but that would be an encouragement to countries, particularly countries in the Middle East, to acquire their own nuclear weapons. I mean, it's a very bad, example. We can talk about the possible candidates there. Anyway, so I think that would be a minimum in this reset. And then there are just a number of other channels of communication that were cut off really after Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, and it continued. Military contacts, we have some of them still. We have deconfliction in Syria, and that works, but that's just one channel. But broader military channels that could be, reconstructed. Political channels, and again, economic, but that would of course depend on a re-examination of sanctions. So I think another element of a reset would be the United States itself rethinking these sanctions, how productive they are, and the extent to which you can use sanctions vis-a-vis Russia to encourage, actions that you would like to have instead of just punitive, because all we have now are all of these punitive sanctions, and there's really no incentive for Russia to change what it's doing because it's going to be impossible to lift them anyway. So I think that sort of complex of sanctions, and then within the US, so much power has now gone to Congress to do this. Under Obama, certainly the executive, he had the ability to impose and lift sanctions. So that I think would be another complex. And then, it would have to be modest. We are working with the Russians in the Arctic. We also compete with them there, but there are areas there where we can work together. This is related to things like climate change. This is an area where we could do more with the Russians. Putin said a number of years ago that actually there'd be nothing wrong if it was 2 degrees warmer in Russia, and it got warmer, but more and more Russians understand that this is an issue. So I think what you'd have to do is to start at some of the, the arms control is the center of this, but to start with some issues that are not maybe in the forefront, but where you can rebuild some elements of cooperation. But I think any kind of normalization that works would also have to include a recognition that the areas where we have common interests, where we must try and work together, but we also shouldn't try to push things with the Russians where our interests really don't coincide and we're not going to get anywhere. And then I think, the whole issue of democracy promotion, all of these issues that actually haven't been very much an issue in the last 4 years, you at least need to rethink it. And then I think at some point you do have to try and talk to the Russians about all of the cyber interference. I mean, the Russians started off in 2017 saying, let's sit down and talk about rules of the road. And, given Russian interference and other things that were going on, the US side was very wary. This is not easy to do, but it's maybe something that people have to try and think about a way of doing it, or at least embarking on some discussions, because otherwise this is only going to get worse.
Thank you for those remarks. And you just brought the subject to climate change and democracy promotion. I was going to ask you about Biden's, party platform. In the foreign policy section, these actually play a prominent role. You don't hear country names as much, Russia, or Iran, but it definitely promises to make democracy promotion a centerpiece of the new Biden foreign policy, and promises to confront what he calls autocrats or autocratic regimes. So in that context, if that's going to be a strong leg of the Biden administration's foreign policy, how would that reflect on Russia? And then you mentioned sanctions, how difficult. it's not going to be up to Biden only. It's gonna there is the whole bad blood from the 2016 election interference, and lifting sanctions, convincing Congress on that one is going to be very difficult too. So, um, are we kind of, when we say hope for a reset, is that kind of a too much of a dream almost?
Yeah, I think it's probably better to use the word normalization, because a reset somehow implies that we can find, you know, a much better way of interacting with Russia, which I think we have to admit and be modest about. It's very difficult. Clearly, if there is more active democracy promotion, that's an issue with the Russians. Obviously, that's something that Putin is allergic to. So one would have to see, you know, how that manifested itself and how that fit in. And of course, the problem with sanctions is that as it's now configured, the Congress really does have the power to do that. And as we know, we've had bipartisan in the Senate agreement on sanctions. I think it was 99-0 on the CATSA sanctions, which is the big legislation from 2017. So irrespective of whether the Congress remains divided, whether Democrats take both houses, even probably if the Republicans took both houses, there seems to be a pretty big consensus. And this is not only vis-a-vis Russia. I mean, this is a much broader topic that when in doubt, if you don't like something, use sanctions. Not always thinking through what, you know, the impact is. And, you know, we've had one now, you know, this big, all of these sanctions trying to prevent the Russians from completing the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline to Europe. And this is, again, where this administration has passed legislation, but it's Democrats voted for it too, which of course punishes our allies and imposes sanctions on our allies almost more than Russia now. And so, you know, so I think that the sanctions issue is quite difficult, but I think it really does need to be kind of confronted and rethought if people are willing to do it.
Thank you. Mark, actually, can we continue on that discussion? As you know, the sanctions against Russia and then sanctions against Turkey as well is kind of hanging out there as part of CATSA sanctions. The sort of, how do you see that legislation evolving? I mean, do you think that the administration, whatever next administration, will need to have a more coherent Russia policy and then somehow, you know, work on these sanctions? And would those sanctions have to be part of that policy? How is that going to work? It's going to be, you know,
I think we need to have a more coherent sanctions policy altogether. In other words, that this is something that I think certainly since our revolution, you know, that the you know, Democrats and Republicans, I mean, they both love sanctions. They may have different targets for them, but that we're wedded to sanctions. And I think that in many cases, we impose sanctions when we really don't want to do anything more forceful. We just want to express our disapproval. And but as we have seen on so many occasions, they don't really seem to work. In other words, there are not that many occasions in which, you know, especially for an authoritarian regime, you impose sanctions on them. They don't exactly buckle under. In fact, it seems to harden them that, you know, the U.S. is our enemy, and therefore, you know, I think that they have to be rethought, the whole utility. And then, you know, as I think Angela mentioned, you know, if we're sanctioning our allies, this is not a recipe for a successful foreign policy at all. I think that, you know, if we don't like what a certain government is doing, maybe it makes sense for the U.S. to impose sanctions on our own trade relationships. But to impose these sanctions on our allies, I think, is really not a very clever thing. It's certainly it alienates them, but it's also sort of a you know, a statement that, you know, we don't trust you to pursue your own interests properly or in the way you think. You have to do it the way we want you to do it, or else. And I think that these sanctions often do hurt our allies more because they do want to keep in good, with our system and our trade and investment, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that our addiction to sanctions really needs to be treated, and it is an addiction. It seems to me that both Democrats and Republicans have. And I just want to say something about the democracy promotion, because in my view, I think that Putin will see. Uh, he believes that his election interference is the reciprocal response to our democracy promotion. In other words, that whether it's actually directed at Russia or how successfully, he sees this personal. This is aimed at him, and I would think that it may be very difficult because we think we're doing something right and we think he's doing something wrong, but I think that he basically thinks of it as the same, that we're having a double standard. In other words, it's okay for us to interfere in Russia's domestic politics, but not for Russia to interfere in ours. And I think that this is something that, as unpleasant as a conversation it would be for us, is that we have to talk about this. I really think that democracy promotion, it mainly makes sense where it's likely to succeed. In other words, there's this, it's certainly like at the end of the Reagan years, beginning of George H.W. Bush, whether it was the Philippines, South Korea, Chile, in other words, where there were domestic forces that were who were really strong, wanting to push the dictatorship out. Sort of an American nudge helped things go the right direction. But I'm not quite sure what the point of doing this is if we're simply going to eliminate governments but not achieve our ends. And then, worst of all, say with some of the color revolutions, whether it was in Georgia or Ukraine, we applaud and cheer that democratic revolution takes place, but then don't really do anything to protect it. In other words, the attitude is that, okay, we've won this, that progress has been made, without sort of thinking about the possibility that there are forces that want to undermine this, that if one is going to promote democracy, one cannot stop once the supposedly democratic revolution occurs, because in fact, this is, what happens afterwards may in fact discredit the new government, and this is where we should be focusing our efforts, it seems to me. And I think there's just been a sense that once things go the right direction, they're there to stay, and that's just not been the case. And so I think go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just going to say, do you think that that's what happened in Libya, for instance, if we were to get back to the region after the US intervention? Of course, there are many other dynamics, but sort of US, I guess Obama, it lasted longer than Obama wanted, that intervention. And then once it was successful, US tried to walk away.
Well, I just think that even Obama, I think, acknowledged, there was a famous interview in The Atlantic, that this was probably his biggest foreign policy error. I think that what people, I think, have forgotten, that one of the few positive achievements of the George W. Bush administration was that we had rapprochement with Muammar Gaddafi. In other words, he gave up his weapons of mass destruction, that he was our partner. And as Rob Litvak at the Wilson Center wrote in his book, if you're going to make agreements about weapons of mass destruction of authoritarian regimes, giving them up, the trade is you accept them. You don't try to overthrow them. And that's exactly what we ended up doing in Libya. There was a fascinating article in International Security who looked at this. In other words, the Gaddafi rhetoric was that he was going to just exterminate his enemies. They were cockroaches or what have you. But when he retook those towns, in fact, they did not behave in this manner at all. But this rhetoric, and in some places, the rhetoric was ugly, but that there are some cultures in which the rhetoric is more awful than the actual actions. And I think we focus more on the rhetoric and less on what Gaddafi was actually doing. And if we were going to go to the trouble to overthrow him, there should have been a much more serious effort made to put something in place that was going to last. And you know, we had the examples of when, you know, Afghanistan and Iraq, what happens when you don't do this. So this shouldn't have been news to the Obama administration, and yet, you know, he got very tired of this, you know, very quickly. And of course, surprise, surprise, the happy story of dictatorship yielding to democracy ended up being dictatorship yielding just pure chaos. You know, I really hope that future democracy promotion efforts, you know, keep this example in mind, that we don't do anything like this again. If we're going to promote democracy, we have to put far more resources into it. It can't just be a feel-good policy we talk about. Either put more resources into it or just don't do it.
And in the Libyan scene, of course, Russia has become a major player as well, just like Syria. Angela, you know, there is reaction to, let's say, Turkey dealing with Russia because they're an actor on the ground and etc. But then we see very good relations between Israel and Russia, but it doesn't draw that much reaction. And again, Biden's foreign policy, you know, platform, at the end they talk about Israel. It's pretty much the same old when it comes to Israel. We don't see a major rethinking about Israel at all. How do you see Israel within this US-Russia? I mean, Netanyahu is able to work both sides pretty well, but how do you assess that relationship?
So I think this is one of the undertold stories. It's kind of under the radar, which is this increasingly close relationship between Israel and Russia on a number of levels. And I think you're right. When you look at US policy platforms, when they talk about Israel, they hardly think about Russia. And you know, it's just they think about it in the same way as they have for the past decades, I think, without recognizing this Russian factor. So, you know, the thing that's I mean, there's first of all Putin himself, who, unlike previous Russian and Soviet leaders, you know, has a different attitude towards Israel, has, I would say, a different attitude towards Jews. And then you have, you know, a couple of million of them, 3 million of them, of the citizens of Israel now are people who emanate from the former Soviet Union. There have been, and despite the fact that they left the Soviet Union, they have close business ties, they have familial ties, they have close ties. And this has been going on sort of for a long time. But I think particularly since Netanyahu came to power, and he and Putin have been in power more or less the same amount of time, Putin a little longer, I would say they share some similar attitudes towards how you deal with people whom you consider to be terrorists. They sort of both have a fairly muscular attitude towards a lot of these security questions. And as Mark was saying, Russia has in fact, you know, and Russia does have cards to play in the Syrian operation, obviously, because it's the Israelis who turn to the Russians to help them vis-a-vis Hezbollah, because Russia does talk to the Iranians. As Mark said, the Russians have not prevented the Israelis from doing certain things that they've done. They've also apparently sometimes leaned on Iran in terms of what Hezbollah might or may not have done. Netanyahu visits Putin quite often. There's a kind of dependence there. And then there's something else that Mark alluded to, which is a whole high-tech relationship, an economic relationship, but with many different dimensions. So this is something that I think, as again, people don't spend very much time looking at. But if you go to Israel and you talk to people who look at Russia, who deal with foreign policy issues in general, Russia is a major factor there. And it doesn't, of course, it doesn't have the same heft as the United States, but it's, you know, becoming increasingly a player there. I think the interesting question for me is, if Putin were no longer in the Kremlin, would that still be the case? Because some of this, as I say, is personal. It's also geopolitical. But I think it's a factor that's there and that's not going to change.
From Israel to sort of broader Eastern Mediterranean questions, as you know, there are recent tensions between, Turkey and Greece, and also, there's kind of an agreement or agreements between Israel, Egypt, and Greece as well. I've we've heard Biden talk about a while back in an interview with New York Times editorial board. He talks about, sort of not happy about Turkey's actions in the Eastern Mediterranean. How do you see um, U.S. kind of interests there, given that Russia's sort of entering the warm waters is no longer centuries old dream anymore. It's a reality now. How what is US might be what might US be thinking about the Eastern Mediterranean?
Mark, do you want to take that?
I think that the the purpose of the NATO alliance wasn't simply to deter an attack from the east, but was also to manage relations among the NATO allies, which had a history of, before there was NATO, of not being so good. And I think that what we're seeing now is that with the fraying of the sense that of an American commitment to international relations, I think that different countries within our alliance network are at odds more and more. Now, this is of course true with Turkey and Greece, during the Cold War as well. But I think that the U.S. worked to try to freeze this. In other words, okay, certain things would happen, including Cyprus, but that so much, and let's not let this get out of hand. And I think that what we're risking now with the current affair in the Eastern Mediterranean is the beginnings of things getting out of hand. And it's not so much that Russia's obviously involved, but it's also that it's involved with our allies. In other words, that if there's a Israeli, Greek, Egyptian group, well, Russia is also very supportive of Egypt. But it's also supposedly trying to get along with Turkey. So in other words, that here's another example of them being on opposing sides, maybe hoping to manage it, hoping to take advantage of people's unhappiness with the U.S. But I'm not quite sure, just how they're going to be able to do this. I really do think that this is a serious problem, what's going on in the Eastern Mediterranean, and that the U.S. administration really does need to conduct some conflict resolution negotiations, because it's one of these things where even if the question isn't resolved completely, things can get out of hand, and it'll be much more difficult to put back together. And so I think that this is actually highly important, and we need to nip this in the bud.
Mark, you're with the Atlantic Council as well, and that NATO is a major focus there. We've seen in Syria, for instance, Turkey became at odds with not US only, but also France, and now in Libya with France, so there is, like you said, within the NATO alliance, between the allies, there's a lot more friction and problems. And Biden foreign policy document does commit to a revitalization of NATO and international alliances. How real is that going to be? How strong can it be revitalized? And if you revitalize NATO and sort of strengthen it and potentially expand it, then Putin won't be happy. So how do you make up with, reset with Putin, etc.?
I think that this has been at the heart of Russia's misunderstanding of what NATO is all about. In other words, they think it's all about them, that expansion to the east has to do with relations with Russia. Whereas in fact, after the Cold War, expansion of NATO had to do partly with that, but also partly that these Eastern European countries joining NATO, joining the EU, was the badge of their becoming part of the West. Now we know, of course, that that really hasn't necessarily worked out completely in some of these places where authoritarianism seems to be growing. But I think that you know, the real lesson here, the real importance of NATO is as a conflict resolution mechanism among the members as themselves. So it's not just to deal with external threats; it has to deal with dealing with internal problems, and that I would hope that, you know, if there is a Biden administration, that they not assume that this is going to be easy, that just because it's Biden and not Trump, everything's going to go back to the way it was, that that time and effort, serious time and effort, are going to have to be devoted to making sure that this problem in the Eastern Mediterranean does not get out of hand. And I would hope that they would be aware of that.
Angela, same question.
Yeah, I mean, you know, a lot more damage has been done in the past 4 years to kind of U.S.-European relations, and particularly to the U.S. relationship with NATO, than maybe people would have thought was possible. Obviously, the U.S. hasn't pulled out of NATO, as President Trump threatened to do in the beginning, but it's certainly, there's much more questioning there. And from the Russian point of view, obviously, this is very welcome, since, as Mark said, the Russians think that all that NATO is really doing is poised to, you know, attack them potentially, or at least surround them. And that's why the Russians also welcome very much the withdrawal of US troops from Germany. Some of them, yes, are being redeployed nearer Russia, but many of them are coming home. So I think if you have a Biden administration, and there's clearly a commitment to strengthening NATO, restoring those ties, it's going to be difficult. It's not going to be impossible, but the kind of wariness and suspicion of what might happen in the future, all of the Europeans are now on notice that they can no longer believe that Washington is really solidly committed to NATO. And so even if you have a new administration, I'm sure they would want to work together with it, but I think the strains, if you like, will still be there. So I think it's going to be, and in more general, you know, repairing relations with Europe, but it will be more difficult.
This is a bit out of our title, our topic today, but I can't escape the China question, right? Both candidates have to be somewhat hawkish on China now because of COVID-19 and trade issues, economic issues, and strategic competition growing in multiple regions around the world. And of course, Russia wants to be in that game and control and manage that as well, right? How do you see the China angle in the US-Russia relationship?
So, I mean, first of all, the Trump administration has done a lot to push Russia and China closer together. With the joint, you know, you have sanctions on Russia, you have a trade war with China, now you have everything that's happened since the outbreak of the pandemic. And so that relationship was stronger anyway. I mean, it started, the rapprochement that we see now between Russia and China started after the events in Crimea, the war in southeastern Ukraine, and Russia becoming much more dependent on China. So, so I think that you know, that relationship has its own dynamics, but it's become closer as a function of what the U.S. has done. So under a Biden administration, I think you're right. The policy toward China would still be tough. You know, it might be less erratic, it might be more predictable, who knows? It depends obviously what the Chinese do. But I think the idea that the Trump administration has, and some people on the other side of the political spectrum have, that somehow if you improve ties to Russia, that would somehow you know, peel Russia away from China, that Russia would be willing, that Putin would be willing to say, well, I'm going to rethink this relationship with Xi Jinping. I think that misunderstands the extent to which the relationship with China is really an existential question for Putin, because to the extent that he feels that the West threatens his hold on power, he believes that the Chinese will do everything they can to support him in power, as he will do for the Chinese. And you kind of have this axis of authoritarians who want to remake the world in, you know, stressing sovereignty and non-interference and all of these things. So, you know, I said one of the successes of Putin's foreign policy was returning to the Middle East. The other one is this relationship with China, despite the asymmetries, the fact that, you know, China is a rising power, Russia isn't. In the end, in Central Asia, China is going to become the predominant power. I think the Russians have, for now, made that choice for a variety of reasons, and I think it would take something very major to get them to rethink that.
Mark, the same question, China.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think from, you know, the point of view of many Westerners, it's that, oh, you know, China's rise, you know, it threatens us all, including Russia. So here, surely we should be able to cooperate on this issue in particular. But I think that, you know, whatever else challenge China is to Russia, it is not a challenge to the Putin regime. It's arguable whether the West really is a challenge, but Putin thinks it is, that he thinks that we are trying to overthrow him. And that is not the case with China at all. And so I think that, and to the extent I think that Putin sees rising tension between China and the West, I think that he would see this as an opportunity to buck pass. There is not ally with the West against China, but essentially let China and the West deal with each other, much as he lets Israel and Iran deal with each other in Syria. In other words, if he can avoid getting involved between two potential adversaries, that's, you know, if you can even admit that China is a potential adversary, why not let the West and China deal with each other? Why does Russia have to get involved? And I think that he will avoid doing so for as long as he can. That, you know, I think for us, you know, seeking out alliances is sort of our first choice in policy. I think for the Russians, it's like not the first choice. The first choice is to stay out of something, to buck pass, if you will, in adversarial situations, and somehow benefit from this rivalry. He tries to benefit from rivalries elsewhere. Why not between the Sino-American rivalry as well? So that's what I see him doing, and you know, I think that you know, he prefers that China's annoyance be focused on the United States, not on Russia, because there are differences that they do have or could have, and certainly I think that certainly the, you know, there have been American administrations who hope, well, you know, China and America cooperated in the past against the Soviet Union. Maybe we can, there could be a reciprocal, you know, Russian-American cooperation against China. I guess I'd only point out that, you know, the Sino-American cooperation only occurs something like 15 years after the Sino-Soviet rivalry had begun in earnest. And I think that we're not going, we cannot count on a Sino-Russian rift that we can take advantage of. That's just not going to, that's just not a gift that's going to fall into our laps as it may have before. And Russia is going to want to, Putin is going to want to avoid making that choice. Maybe a different Russian leader would be different. I think just as with the relationship with Israel is so Putin dependent, you know, Russia is a country where, you know, successive leaders have a track record of really changing some aspect of the policy of their predecessor. There's no real predicting what that might be, but I could see how a follow-on Russian leader wanting to distinguish himself from Putin might decide that, hey, you know, maybe the West isn't so bad, that China is not the most, you know, sort of convenient neighbor. But I don't think that's going to happen with Putin. That something, the Chinese would have to behave in a really egregious way toward Russia, I think, for him to be able to publicly change his mind about this.
Thank you. Angela, we started off with some connection issues. I just want to give you a minute to sort of sum up, it's especially the part about implications for the Middle East. You said Middle East was a success for Putin. In just a couple sentences, I want to take your concluding remarks.
Well, thank you. It's been a rich discussion, and I'm sorry about the connections at the beginning. So I think for the Middle East going forward, I mean, you have a number of facts, and one of them is that you've had a US that's begun already to withdraw from a number of commitments, not from all of them, but the US remains obviously, militarily much stronger in the Middle East, economically much stronger in the Middle East, but Russia has really managed to insert itself in all of these different conflicts, relations with all of these different countries, arms sales, in that we didn't talk about Saudi Arabia, but the whole oil deal with OPEC, not uncomplicated. So Russia is a player, even if it doesn't have the military and economic resources that the US has, it's a player, and I think it's there to stay. But I think the other thing that we haven't mentioned, we mentioned China vis-a-vis Russia and the US. How about China vis-a-vis the Middle East? So yes. I think that's a subject for another whole discussion.
It is.
But I think looking forward in the future from the point of view of the Middle Eastern countries, this is obviously, they're already dealing with China. They will continue to do so in the future. I think that will be the interesting thing to watch, the extent to which China and how China exerts its own influence in the Middle East.
Thank you, Mark.
Well, yes, I think that it would be sort of, I think, funny if for Russia, if its moment in the Middle East is the moment between sort of the declining U.S. interest on the one hand and rising Chinese interest on the other, because I think that if and when China does decide to become interested in the Middle East, and there's increasing signs that it is, I think that Russia would be loath to challenge it in many respects. And they have one very basic difference, and that is China, an oil importer, wants low oil prices. Russia, an oil exporter, wants high prices. Mm-hmm. And so I think that this is just a basic difference between them, and the thing is, I think the U.S. we're a little bit discomfited that so many of our allies are working with the Russians, but they'll work with the Chinese, and perhaps even more, because the Chinese have the investment money, the ability to trade that Russia doesn't have, and it's not competing with them in the market as well. So I think that Russia will have a hard time being the great power in the Middle East. I think that at best it's only going to be a great power, because when China is there, it's going to be very influential.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm going to conclude this session, but I want to thank both Mark Hatz and Angela Stant. This has been such a rich discussion. We talked about the Middle East, but we also talked about grand strategy in many ways, NATO, China, etc. I want to thank our audience as well for joining this session. Please sort of join me thanking our guests again, Professor Stant and Katz. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.